The Legend of Bonnie and Clyde. The morning was still. The air was thick with tension. A dusty Ford the 5'8" rumbled down a quiet country road in Louisiana. Inside, Bonnie and Clyde laughed, unaware that death waited just ahead. Hidden among the trees, 6 lawmen gripped their rifles, their fingers twitching over the triggers. They had been chasing these outlaws for years. Today, the chase would end. The car slowed. Gunfire exploded. Bullets tore through metal, shattered glass, and ripped into flesh. 16 seconds later, Bonnie and Clyde were gone. But their story? Their story had just begun. This wasn't just a crime spree. It was a legend in the making, a tale of love, danger, and betrayal. Some called them rebels, fighting against a broken system. Others called them monsters, leaving behind a trail of blood. The truth? That depends on who you ask. The early lives of Bonnie and Clyde. A. Bonnie Parker, the poet who dreamed of fame. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was born on October 1, 1910, in the small town of Rowena, Texas. She was the second of 3 children in a family that had more dreams than money. Her father, Charles Parker, worked as a bricklayer, a job that barely put food on the table. But when he died suddenly, Bonnie was just 4 years old. With no other options, her mother Emma Parker packed up the family and moved them to West Dallas, a rough, poverty-stricken neighborhood where people struggled just to survive. But Bonnie? She was different. She wasn't like the other kids who accepted their fate. Bonnie dreamed of something bigger. She had a way with words, filling the pages of her notebooks with poetry, songs, and stories of adventure. At school, teachers noticed her sharp mind and creative spark. She was small, barely over 5 feet tall, with reddish blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, but there was fire in her. While other girls dreamed of marriage and children, Bonnie dreamed of fame. She imagined herself on stage, in front of flashing cameras, writing books, or starring in movies. She wanted more than just the life of a seamstress or waitress, which was the expected path for girls in her world. But dreams don't always pay the bills. At 15, Bonnie made a choice that would change her forever. She fell for a local boy named Roy Thornton, a smooth talker, a troublemaker, and, in Bonnie's eyes, a way out of poverty. They married in 1926, just days before her 16th birthday. At first, Bonnie thought she had found her adventure. She imagined love, excitement, and freedom. But she was wrong. Roy was abusive, unreliable, and always in trouble with the law. He disappeared for weeks at a time, leaving Bonnie alone to wonder where he was, what he was doing, and who he was with. She held on, believing things would get better. But in 1929, Roy was arrested and sent to prison. Bonnie never filed for divorce, but in her heart, the marriage was over. She was alone, working as a waitress in Dallas, barely making enough to survive. And then fate intervened. Because in January 1930, Bonnie met Clyde Barrow. And from the moment their eyes locked, her world would never be the same again. Clyde Barrow, the boy who turned to crime. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born on March 24, 1909, in Ellis County, Texas, just outside Dallas. He was the 5th of 7 children, born into a family that knew nothing but struggle. His parents, Henry and Cummy Barrow, were poor farmers who fought every day to keep their children fed. Life on a Texas farm in the early 1900s was brutal. The sun was relentless, the land was unforgiving, and money was scarce. The Barrow family had nothing, but Henry Barrow was determined to find a better life. So, in the early 1920s, they packed up and moved to West Dallas, hoping for work, hoping for a chance. But West Dallas was no paradise. The neighborhood was a slum, packed with families just like the Barrows, dirt poor, struggling, desperate. They didn't even have a house at first. They lived under their wagon until Henry could scrape together enough money to buy a tent. For young Clyde, poverty was a cage. And he was determined to escape. As a teenager, Clyde was small but fast, with dark wavy hair and an easy charm. He wasn't just another poor boy, he had style, he had charisma, and most importantly he had ambition. But he wasn't interested in honest work. While other boys were shining shoes or selling newspapers, Clyde was learning how to steal. At 17, he was arrested for the first time, caught trying to run off with a stolen rental car. He got lucky that time. The charges were dropped. But Clyde had tasted trouble, and he liked it. Over the next few years, he dove deeper into crime. Stealing cars, robbing stores, cracking safes. And then, in January 1930, he walked into a friend's house in Dallas, and met Bonnie Parker. That moment, it changed everything. Clyde saw a girl who was different from any he had ever met. Bonnie saw a man who could give her the excitement she craved. Neither of them knew it yet. But their names would soon become legend. The meeting that changed everything. It was January 1930, a cold winter evening in West Dallas. The streets were filled with the usual sounds of struggle, men arguing over jobs, mothers calling their children home, the occasional police siren echoing in the distance. Inside a small, dimly lit house, the smell of cheap coffee and cigarette smoke lingered in the air. Friends had gathered, some laughing, some whispering about trouble brewing in the city. Among them was Bonnie Parker, just 19 years old, sitting at the kitchen table. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was just helping a friend who had broken her arm, staying over to lend a hand. But fate had other plans. Because that night, Clyde Barrow walked through the door. And in that moment everything changed. Love at first sight, or first crime. Clyde was small but confident, with dark, slicked back hair and a sharp grin that could make anyone believe whatever story he was telling. He wasn't just another poor boy from West Dallas, he had swagger, he had charm, and he had a past that made him exciting. Bonnie was instantly intrigued. She had spent her life waiting for something bigger, something thrilling, and Clyde looked like an adventure in human form. And Clyde. He saw more than just a pretty girl. Bonnie was different. She wasn't like the girls he had met before. She was fierce, loyal, and had a hunger for more. He saw someone who wouldn't just follow him but would stand beside him, no matter what. That night, they talked for hours. They shared stories, dreams, and laughter. Clyde told Bonnie about his run-ins with the law, his love for fast cars, and his dream of making something of himself on his own terms. Bonnie, in turn, spoke of poetry, of Hollywood, of a world beyond the dusty streets of Dallas. It wasn't just attraction. It was destiny. By the time the sun rose, one thing was certain: Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were inseparable. Arrest and a daring escape. Their time together was short-lived. Just weeks after they met, Clyde was arrested for stealing a car, a crime he had committed before he even met Bonnie. Suddenly, their new love was ripped apart. Clyde was dragged away in handcuffs, leaving Bonnie behind with a heart full of rage and a mind full of ideas. And that's when Bonnie did something that would seal her fate forever. She decided to help him escape. She smuggled a gun into the prison, slipping it to Clyde during a visit. A few nights later, Clyde and a few other inmates broke out, racing through the darkness, tasting freedom for just a moment. But freedom didn't last long. Clyde was caught again, and this time, they didn't send him to some local jail. They sent him to Eastham Prison Farm, the worst place a man could end up. Eastham Prison, where Clyde became a killer. Eastham was hell on earth. Inmates were treated like animals, forced to work from sunrise to sunset, beaten for the smallest mistake. But for Clyde, it was worse. He was young, small, and in a place where men preyed on the weak. And that's when it happened. Clyde was sexually assaulted by another inmate. But he didn't just take it. He waited, planned, and one night he took revenge. He grabbed a steel pipe and crushed his abuser's skull, killing him instantly. But Clyde was clever. Another inmate, a man already serving a life sentence, took the blame for the murder, knowing he had nothing left to lose. Clyde walked away without punishment, but he was no longer the same man. Something inside him had snapped. A desperate move and a permanent limp. Clyde knew he had to get out. Prison wasn't just breaking him, it was destroying him. So he made a brutal decision. To avoid the brutal hard labor forced upon him daily, Clyde took an axe and chopped off 2 of his own toes. The pain was unimaginable, but it worked. He was sent to the infirmary, no longer fit for the back-breaking work in the fields. But here's the twist: he didn't have to do it. Because just 6 days later, Clyde's mother managed to get him released on parole. If he had just waited 1 more week, he would have walked free with both feet intact. Instead, for the rest of his life, he would walk with a limp, a constant reminder of what prison had done to him. Clyde returns a different man. On February 2, 1932, Clyde Barrow walked out of Eastham Prison. But the Clyde who went in was not the Clyde who came out. The charismatic troublemaker was gone. What remained was a hardened, ruthless criminal, a man who had killed, had suffered, and had no intention of ever being locked up again. And now, he wanted revenge. Not just against the police, but against the entire system that had chewed him up and spat him out. And waiting for him, as loyal as ever, was Bonnie Parker. She had spent the last 2 years writing letters, dreaming of the day Clyde would come back. And now that he was free, they weren't just going to run away together. They were going to burn their names into history. The legend of Bonnie and Clyde was about to begin. The birth of the Barrow Gang. By 1932, Clyde Barrow was no longer just a petty thief. He had hardened, determined to never again be a prisoner. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. If he was going to survive, if he was going to take back control, he needed a crew. And so, the Barrow Gang was born. Bonnie was with him, of course. She wouldn't have it any other way. But they weren't alone. Clyde's older brother, Buck Barrow, was a seasoned criminal himself, fresh out of prison and eager to join his younger brother. Buck's wife, Blanche, wasn't a criminal at heart, but she was loyal. Then there was Raymond Hamilton, a reckless and ambitious young outlaw. And W.D. Jones, a 16-year-old kid who had grown up admiring Clyde, desperate to prove himself. Together, they weren't just a group of criminals. They were a gang. The crime spree begins. The first few months were about survival. They started small, stealing cars, robbing grocery stores, knocking over gas stations. They moved fast, never staying in one place too long. But Clyde, he had bigger plans. His sights were set on banks. Back then, banks weren't like the steel fortress institutions we know today. Security was weak, and the country was still drowning in the Great Depression. People were desperate, and banks were hated, seen as the enemy that had stolen people's homes and savings. And in the eyes of many, Clyde wasn't just a criminal. He was a rebel. Their first murder, April 30th, 1932. But Clyde wasn't a hero. He wasn't a Robin Hood. He was dangerous, and his crime spree soon turned deadly. On April 30th, 1932, the Barrow Gang hit a store in Hillsboro, Texas. It was supposed to be just another robbery, in and out, take the money, and disappear. But something went wrong. The store owner, J.N. Booker, tried to resist. A gun was drawn. A struggle. Then bang. Booker fell to the floor, lifeless. It's unclear who fired the fatal shot. Clyde always denied pulling the trigger. But it didn't matter. Someone was dead, and now the gang wasn't just a group of thieves. They were killers. First cop down, August 5, 1932. A few months later, in Stringtown, Oklahoma, the gang was at a country dance, drinking moonshine and laying low. It was one of those rare nights where they could just be normal, even for a little while. But normal never lasted long. Sheriff C.G. Maxwell and Deputy Eugene Moore arrived at the dance, suspicious of the strangers in town. Before the officers could react, Clyde and Raymond Hamilton drew their guns. Gunfire erupted in the night, sending the dance floor into chaos. Deputy Eugene Moore was dead before he even hit the ground. Sheriff Maxwell barely escaped with his life. Now, the Barrow Gang wasn't just wanted. They were hunted. The violence escalates. After that night, the gang changed. They became hardened, more ruthless. They stopped hesitating to pull the trigger. They weren't just robbing stores and banks anymore, they were willing to kill to stay free. Every robbery ended in bloodshed. If the police caught up, bullets flew. And the public? They were fascinated. Clyde and Bonnie became legends in the making, but their most infamous moment was still to come. The Joplin shootout, becoming famous. By April 1933, the gang was growing careless. They needed a place to hide, a temporary safe house. They found one in Joplin, Missouri, a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. For 2 weeks, they laid low. But they weren't exactly subtle. Loud drinking, gambling, shouting neighbors started getting suspicious. And then, the biggest mistake of all, Clyde accidentally fired a gun inside the apartment while cleaning it. That was enough. Someone called the police. The shootout, April 13, 1933. A 5-man police force arrived that afternoon, expecting to bust a bootlegging operation. They had no idea they were walking into a gang of killers. The moment they knocked on the door, chaos erupted. The gang opened fire immediately, unleashing hell. Detective Harry McGinnis was shot and killed instantly. Constable Wes Harriman was hit multiple times, dying from his wounds. Clyde, firing his beloved Browning automatic rifle, bar, shredded the walls and windows, forcing the remaining officers to retreat. As bullets tore through the apartment, the gang scrambled to escape. Bonnie grabbed her dog. Blanche was screaming. They barely made it out alive. The police were left with 2 dead officers and a scene of destruction. But that wasn't all they left behind. The photographs that shocked America. In their panic to escape, the gang left behind something far more dangerous than bullets. They left a roll of undeveloped film. The photos inside. Bonnie and Clyde, posing with guns, cigarettes in their mouths, grinning like they owned the world. And just like that, they became famous. Bonnie's cigar, the image that defined an outlaw. One photo, in particular, caught the nation's attention. Bonnie Parker, leaning on a stolen car, grinning as she held a shotgun in one hand and a cigar in the other. She looked wild, rebellious, fearless, a woman who didn't care about the rules. The press went crazy. The smoking gun moll, they called her. The outlaw queen. The truth? Bonnie didn't even smoke cigars. She had been playing around, posing for fun. But the image stuck, and Bonnie Parker was never seen the same way again. She wasn't just Clyde's girl anymore. She was an outlaw in her own right. And now, everyone knew their names. A gang with nowhere left to hide. After Joplin, things only got worse. The gang was front-page news, their faces plastered across the country. Law enforcement stepped up their hunt. The public devoured every story about them. Bonnie and Clyde had become celebrities, but not the kind that lived long. Because with every robbery, every murder, and every close call, they were racing toward an ending that would go down in history. The dark side of life on the run. By late 1933, the Barrow Gang was running out of time. They had gone from small-time criminals to public enemy number 1, with their faces on wanted posters across the country. What had started as a thrill ride, fast cars, easy money, and outwitting the law had turned into a desperate fight for survival. Constantly hiding. They could never stop moving. Every town, every road, every safe house, none of it was safe for long. They drove hundreds of miles a day, never staying in the same place twice. When night came, they slept in stolen cars, parked deep in the woods or on empty back roads. They lived off gas station food, canned beans, and whatever scraps they could steal. Bathing? Forget it. Rivers, lakes, and stolen jugs of water were all they had. And in the winter? The cold seeped through their bones, cutting deeper than any bullet ever could. But Bonnie never complained. Not even when everything changed. The crash that nearly killed Bonnie. One night in 1933, Clyde was speeding down a dark Texas road, with Bonnie in the passenger seat and W.D. Jones in the back. The car was hot, stolen just hours before, and they needed to put distance between them and the police. Clyde pushed the Ford the Fifth 8 to its limit, the speedometer creeping past 80 miles per hour. Then, he missed a detour sign. A construction zone. A patch of loose gravel. The car slid out of control, flipped, and slammed into a dry riverbed. The crash was brutal, twisting metal and shattering glass, but Clyde and Jones managed to crawl out. Bonnie. She wasn't so lucky. The impact had pinned her leg against the burning exhaust, the metal searing into her skin. By the time Clyde pulled her free, her right leg was covered in third-degree burns. The flesh was blackened, peeling away in places, the pain so unbearable that Bonnie nearly blacked out. She would never walk the same way again. A wounded outlaw. For most people, this would have been the end of the road. The injury was horrific. Her leg tightened, twisted, leaving her with a crippling limp. Some days, she couldn't walk at all. Clyde carried her when she couldn't move, wrapping her leg in stolen bandages and forcing moonshine down her throat to dull the pain. He begged her to stay behind, to find safety. But Bonnie? She refused. Her love for Clyde was bigger than the pain. She wasn't going to stop running. She wasn't going to leave his side. And so, even as her body failed her, even as the gang crumbled, Bonnie kept going. But the pain, the fatigue, the constant running, it was wearing them all down. And when people get tired, they get reckless. The crime wave intensifies. Clyde was getting bolder. More daring. More ruthless. With Bonnie injured and the gang growing desperate, Clyde pushed the limits. The robberies became sloppier. The getaways became more dangerous. And the killings. They became routine. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. Cops. Shot on sight. Witnesses. Left bleeding on the floor. They weren't outlaws playing a game anymore. They were cornered animals, striking out before the trap could close in. But Clyde was about to cross the final line. He was about to poke the one bear you never poke. Eastham Prison Break, January 1934. Clyde had never forgotten Eastham Prison. The abuse. The beatings. The years of his life stolen. And in January 1934, he got his revenge. Before dawn, Clyde led a prison break so daring, so brutal, that it sent shockwaves through the entire country. He stormed Eastham, armed to the teeth, and broke out 5 prisoners, including Henry Methven, a man who would later play a deadly role in their downfall. During the escape, one of the freed convicts shot and killed a guard. Clyde didn't even flinch. By the time the dust settled, the Texas government had had enough. They were done playing games. They weren't just hunting Clyde anymore. They were going to kill him. Enter Frank Hamer, the man who would end it all. Texas called in a legend. A man with 53 confirmed kills. A ranger feared by criminals and respected by the law. His name was Frank Hamer, and he had one job. Find Bonnie and Clyde. And put them in the ground. Hamer didn't make arrests. He didn't take prisoners. He was a hunter, and Clyde was his prey. For the first time, Bonnie and Clyde weren't chasing their next score. They weren't outsmarting the cops. They weren't the ones in control. Now, they were the ones being hunted. And no one, not even Bonnie's love or Clyde's luck, was going to stop what came next. Because their final chapter was just around the corner. The end is near, trapped in a deadly ambush. By spring 1934, Bonnie and Clyde had nowhere left to run. The law was closing in, and this time, there would be no narrow escapes. No lucky breaks. Just a storm of bullets waiting for them at the end of the road. And the man who would lead them into that storm? Someone they thought they could trust. Betrayal and setup. For all his crimes, Clyde Barrow trusted one thing above all else: loyalty. His gang was his family, the people who had been by his side through every robbery, every shootout, every close call. But when you're desperate, when the law is closing in, loyalty has a price. And for Henry Methvin? That price was his own freedom. Henry Methvin wasn't just another gang member. He was part of the Eastham prison escape, one of the men Clyde had risked everything to break out. But unlike Clyde, Henry wasn't looking to die a legend. He was looking for a way out. And the police gave him one. If he helped set up Bonnie and Clyde, his own crimes would be forgiven. All he had to do was lead them to the slaughter. So a plan was set in motion. A trap so perfect, so meticulously designed, that Bonnie and Clyde wouldn't even see it coming. Methvin's father was the key. The police coerced him into playing his part. He would park his truck on a quiet country road, pretending to have engine trouble. Clyde, who trusted Methvin, would stop to help, never suspecting that he was driving straight into his own execution. Waiting for him would be 6 lawmen, armed with rifles, shotguns, and a thirst for revenge. They had no intentions of making an arrest. They weren't bringing Bonnie and Clyde in alive. This wasn't going to be a trial. This was going to be an execution. The deadly ambush. The morning of May 23, 1934 was like any other. Bonnie and Clyde sped through the Louisiana backroads, their stolen Ford the 5.8 kicking up dust on the sun-baked pavement. They had been running for years, but for the first time in a long time, things felt calm. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind them. They had no idea that they were minutes away from death. Up ahead, the trap was set. The truck sat motionless on the side of the road, just as planned. Clyde spotted it immediately, recognizing it as Methvin's father's vehicle. He tapped the brakes, slowing the car to a crawl. Bonnie, half asleep, rubbed her eyes and looked over at Clyde. "What's going on?" she murmured. Clyde shrugged. "Looks like he's got some car trouble." He had no way of knowing that just a few feet away, hidden in the trees, 6 officers were watching his every move. Fingers on triggers. Waiting. Waiting for the moment to end it all. Bang. The first shot shattered the quiet morning air. A direct hit. A rifle round tore through Clyde's skull, killing him instantly. His foot slipped off the brake, and the Ford the 5.8 rolled forward slowly. Bonnie screamed, her eyes darting around in shock, trying to understand what had just happened. Then came the storm. The gunfire was relentless. A hail of bullets, 130 rounds, fired in under 20 seconds. Glass shattered, metal twisted, the car was ripped to pieces. Bonnie's screams were cut short as bullets tore through her chest, arms, legs. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. Smoke rose from the bullet-riddled car, the only sound was the distant chirping of birds. For the first time in 4 years, Bonnie and Clyde weren't running anymore. They were dead. And the legend? The legend was just beginning. The aftermath, death, fame, and legend. Bonnie and Clyde were gone, but in many ways, their story was just beginning. The moment their blood-soaked bodies slumped in that Ford the 5.8, they stopped being fugitives and became legends. But what came next was something out of a nightmare. The bloody aftermath. Before the dust had even settled, crowds began to gather at the site of the ambush. People rushed from their homes, abandoning whatever they were doing just to get a glimpse of the infamous outlaws. And what they saw? It was gruesome. The car was a mangled wreck, barely recognizable under the sheer volume of bullet holes. Inside, Bonnie and Clyde were lifeless, their bodies riddled with gunfire, slumped together in the front seat like broken dolls. Blood dripped from the torn leather seats, pooling onto the dusty road beneath them. It was a gruesome end, but the real horror was just beginning. The officers didn't move the bodies immediately. No. They let them sit there, letting the gathered crowd gawk and take in the sight. To them, this wasn't just the end of a manhunt, this was a victory. They had spent years chasing Bonnie and Clyde, and now, their bodies were on full display, like trophies of a hunt. And the crowd wanted souvenirs. People rushed forward, trying to grab anything they could. One man cut a piece of Bonnie's hair, stuffing it in his pocket. Another soaked a handkerchief in their blood, as if it were some kind of twisted keepsake. Someone even tried to cut off Clyde's trigger finger before being shoved away by police. This wasn't justice. This was a spectacle. And the worst was still to come. A morbid carnival. The officers loaded the bodies into the back of a truck, driving them to a nearby town for autopsy. But this was no quiet transfer. The streets were flooded with people, all desperate to catch one last look at the infamous couple. Bonnie and Clyde, once the most feared outlaws in America, were now just two bodies, paraded through town like circus attractions. And that Ford the 5th? The car that had carried them through years of crime, chases, and shootouts? It became a traveling exhibit. People paid to see it up close, to run their fingers over the bullet holes, to imagine what it must have been like in those final moments. Bonnie and Clyde were dead, but their legend had just entered the history books. The funeral and controversy. When it came time to lay them to rest, Bonnie and Clyde had only one wish: to be buried side by side. After all, they had lived together, died together, why not rest together? But not everyone agreed. Bonnie's mother refused. She had never approved of Clyde, never believed he was good enough for her daughter. And even in death, she would not let them be together. So while Clyde was buried next to his brother Buck, Bonnie was laid to rest in another cemetery, alone. But the story didn't end there. More than 20,000 people attended Bonnie's funeral, packing the streets to say goodbye. Some were there to mourn. Some were there to gawk. But all of them were there for one reason: Bonnie and Clyde were more than just criminals. They were legends. And legends never truly die. The legacy, heroes or villains. Bonnie and Clyde died in a hail of bullets, but in many ways, their story was just beginning. In life, they were outlaws, murderers, and fugitives. But in death, they became something else entirely. The Hollywood effect. It didn't take long for Hollywood to come calling. The 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, turned them into romanticized anti-heroes. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were rebels. Young, wild, and in love. The movie glossed over the brutal murders, the suffering of the victims, and the chaos they left behind. Instead, it painted a picture of two misunderstood lovers, trapped in a world that gave them no way out. It was a lie, but it was a beautiful one. The film became a massive cultural phenomenon, making Bonnie and Clyde household names once again. And for decades, that version of the story was the one people chose to believe. Then came 2019's The Highwayman, and suddenly, the world saw a different side. This time, the story wasn't about Bonnie and Clyde's daring escapes and tragic romance. It was about the men who hunted them down. The film followed Frank Hamer, the relentless Texas Ranger who had spent months tracking their every move. It pulled back the curtain, revealing the true Bonnie and Clyde: not heroes, not misunderstood rebels, but cold-blooded killers who left behind a trail of devastation. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, it didn't matter. By then, Bonnie and Clyde's legacy had already been cemented in history. The truth. Here's what the movies don't always show. Bonnie and Clyde weren't Robin Hood figures. They didn't steal from the rich to give to the poor. They didn't fight against the system for some noble cause. They were killers. Over 2 years, they murdered 13 people, including 9 police officers. Some victims never saw the bullets coming. Others begged for their lives. And Clyde. He pulled the trigger without hesitation. But still, there's something about Bonnie and Clyde that captivates people even today. They were young. They were desperate. They were reckless. And maybe, in some twisted way, they represented something bigger than themselves. To some, they were products of the Great Depression, young people with no options, no future, and no way out. To others, they were dangerous criminals, responsible for destroying innocent lives. So, were they victims of their time? Or were they ruthless killers who got exactly what they deserved? Even now, almost a century later, the debate rages on. But one thing is certain. Bonnie and Clyde may have died that day in Louisiana. But their story? That will live forever. The tragic tale of Bonnie and Clyde. And so, their story comes to an end. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, 2 young lovers who lived fast, ran hard, and died in a storm of bullets. Were they victims of a cruel world, driven to crime by desperation? Or were they ruthless killers, leaving a path of destruction in their wake? History remembers them both ways. To some, they were rebels against a broken system, modern-day Romeo and Juliet, forever trapped in the pages of America's outlaw history. To others, they were cold-blooded murderers, criminals who killed without mercy and met the only fate they truly deserved. But no matter how you see them, one thing is undeniable. Bonnie and Clyde became legends. Not because they were heroes. Not because they were villains. But because their story was too wild, too tragic, too unforgettable to fade into the past. And perhaps, Bonnie knew it all along. She once wrote in her poem, "Someday they'll go down together. And they'll bury them side by side." But in the end, they weren't. Clyde was buried next to his brother. Bonnie was laid to rest elsewhere, apart from the man she had risked everything for. Separated. Even in death. Now, it's your turn to decide. Were they misunderstood rebels or heartless killers? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep questioning the past.